Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Wagner with NAMI New Hampshire, and I work on the first episode Psychosis Early Serious Mental Illness Initiative. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled CBD, What You Need to Know in an Era of Commercial Cannabis. This presentation is being recorded, and you'll be able to find it on the education page of onwardnh.org. In the next couple of days, you'll receive a follow-up email with links to both an evaluation and the recording. This is a Zoom webinar. That means your camera and microphone are off. The chat is working. Pardon me. The Q&A is working, so please enter any comments or questions you have there. My colleague, Karen Prive, is with us, and she will help field your questions. So today we're talking about an important topic, CBD, which is short for cannabidiol. Joining us to talk about this substance is Scott Gagnon. He's the director of SAMHSA, that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. He's with the New England Prevention Technology Transfer Center, the NEPTTC. He is a certified prevention specialist and also the associate director of AdCare at Educational Institute of Maine. He's a national speaker and trainer on cannabis policy and prevention. Scott also serves as a board member of the Maine Recovery Coach Certification Board and is a member representing public health on Maine's Cannabis Advisory Commission. And with that, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. Let me pop up my slides here for today. So title for my presentation is CBD, What You Need to Know in the Era of Commercial Cannabis. And so that's really what I hope to accomplish over the next hour, is to just provide you some information some that we've been put together just to give you some, maybe another lens into what we know or don't know around CBD in terms of potential different impacts, and also just to talk a little bit about how it's handled in a kind of regulatory kind of way. Before I launch into content, though, I do need to do just a couple disclaimers. One is that this presentation is provided or been prepared through our New England Prevention Technology Transfer Center program, New England PTTC, which is a cooperative agreement we have with SAMHSA, and you can see our cooperative agreement number there. But also just to stress that the views and opinions that I present in this presentation are those of the presenter and myself, and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Just a couple words about the New England PTTC for folks who may not have heard of us or what we do. And so we're, as I mentioned, a cooperative agreement. There's actually three partners: ourselves, AdCare, and then also our partners at the Co-occurring Collaborative Serving Maine and Public Consulting Group, who are evaluators. We're one of 10 regional centers across the country, and our charge from SAMHSA is to provide training and technical assistance in the realm of substance use prevention. And really that means that we can provide training and TA to anyone that's in the business or working on any kind of initiatives or strategies related to preventing substance misuse. So a large part of our audience is folks who are in prevention coalitions or funded per state or federally funded prevention roles, but it can really be very broad. So folks who are on this call who may have interest or initiatives around prevention, we can work with you as well. So really we're all about getting that prevention science into practice to make sure that everything that's being implemented in prevention is science-based, and leveraging also some of the expertise and resources that we have available to the federal government and other partners in the region. And so we do that through a lot of different modalities: in-person trainings, webinars such as this, some self-paced courses, and learning communities, and a bunch of other different types of products. So I will have my contact information at the end. So as we go through this and you think, oh, we have an idea of some help we need, you'll know how to get in touch with us to request assistance. Finally, one other disclaimer is, as a PTTC network, we believe very strongly in using affirmative language, person's first language. So that's something I will strive for in my presentation today, and as we discuss this content together. One other little terminology piece I do want to start with as well is that when it comes to this topic, and of course, we know CBD is related to cannabis and marijuana. That is sort of a terminology thing that is still a little murky right now. when I say the field, I mean, I'm largely talking about the prevention field, but probably even larger to the behavioral field, behavioral health field and beyond. We're not really quite settled yet on what terminology we should be using. Should we say cannabis? Should we say marijuana? What makes it even trickier is that policy, in some policies, whether it's a state level policy or certainly at the federal level, the word marijuana can be enshrined in a policy. So that's a term that's used, or vice versa, cannabis could be. And we also have to acknowledge that not every audience we're speaking to will understand what cannabis means, but they may understand what marijuana means. So this is just all to say that we're not quite in a settled place with the terminology. But why I wanted to bring it up is, for me as a presenter, I will tend to use the word cannabis versus marijuana. That's just kind of what I've come to as a professional in terms of the terminology I want to use, but just wanted to kind of put that at the top. So if you hear me use one versus the other, that's why. Now, that said, I do also have a lot of material that I pulled from SAMHSA for this webinar, and they do tend to still use the term marijuana. So if you do see references to marijuana, it's because of sources I'm citing. One other acknowledgement is, as I mentioned, there's a lot of content here that I'm bringing in that was developed by SAMHSA's National Mental Health and Substance Use Policy Lab for a webinar that we co-sponsored back in August. And the leads on that were Radha Krishnan and Amy Beringer. So I just want to acknowledge the work that they did on some of these materials. So what are we going to cover today? So first we'll talk about just a kind of introduction or maybe reintroduction to the cannabis plant in terms of what is CBD and how does it differ from THC, which are two of the sort of the most popular or well-known components of the cannabis plant. Talk a little bit about what started sort of the CBD explosion, why you see so many products in stores, how did that all come about? Talk a little bit about the marketing and availability around CBD, a little bit of data to talk about what we know currently around some of the prevalence rates and demographics of CBD use, some of the ways that CBD is used in terms of the over-the-counter products, what we know about some of the adverse effects of pure CBD, some of the potential harms of over-the-counter CBD, and then talk a little about some populations of special concern. And then we'll wrap it up with a few slides with some tips and action steps that different audiences or different sectors can take around, having this information. What can you do with it? So a lot of this content I'm going to be talking about did come from this SAMHSA advisory that was put together. So they did a lot of work and research to pull together a lot of this research and data and information. So that's a lot of where this will come from. And I have a link at the end where you'll be able to download the advisory, which has more detailed information than we'll go over in the next hour. So starting with, kind of, again, an introduction or reintroduction of the cannabis plant, and where does CBD come from and how does it all fit in? So scientifically, cannabis really belongs to this small family of flowering plants. It's called Cannabisaceae, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's also known as the hemp family. So when you hear about the hemp plant, that's kind of what people are usually referring to. Now, the cannabis plant has a lot of chemicals in it. So as we see here, 500 chemicals. About 100 of those, approximately, that we know so far, are phytocannabinoids, or commonly referred to as cannabinoids. And those are in the trichomes of the female flowers of the plant. That's where those are found. So again, two of the more commonly understood or sort of popular or discussed cannabinoids are delta-9 tetracannabinol or delta-9 THC and cannabidiol or CBD. There's also a third one that's delta-8 THC, which is also being marketed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the policy piece in the Farm Bill. So you do see on this slide, just if you were a chemistry geek, what the actual molecules look like for these three chemicals. I do want to note, because this came up before in the past when I've provided this information, you'll see that the Wikipedia citation, I just want to make sure that's only for the photos. It's not for the actual content. The content came from other places. I want to make sure folks know we're not citing Wikipedia for the actual information. It was just to cite where these photos came from. So as you can see, though, when you look at it, the structure of these three chemicals are very similar, but those small differences make a big difference in terms of how they interact with the body, and then therefore some of the adverse effects or other kind of effects that we can observe through the research. So talking about hemp versus marijuana or cannabis. So under the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946, there was an amendment in 2018, which is commonly referred to as the Farm Bill. So there were a lot of changes made to that Agricultural Act and the Farm Bill. One of those had to deal with hemp. And so again, with the terminology of hemp means a cannabis plant or any part of the plant with a delta-9 THC concentration of less than 0.3% on a dry weight basis. And so that's important. So anything less than that amount is commonly referred to as hemp. Anything more than that at the federal level is called marijuana. So that's how the federal government kind of distinguishes between the two. There's other botanical differences between the plants, but in terms of the chemical content, in terms of hemp policy and marijuana policy at the federal level, that's an important dividing line. So if you have something that's 1% THC, that's not going to be called hemp, it's going to be called marijuana or cannabis. That's what we see here. So anything above 0.3% delta-9 THC on a dry weight basis is going to be called marijuana. So before I go into the next slide, so I do just want to talk a little bit more about the delta-8. So I don't really have a lot of information here, but so one of the side effects of the Farm Bill was this kind of loophole that was created that essentially allowed for, which we'll talk about a little bit, had something to do with the explosion of the CBD products, but it's also led to this unintended consequence of proliferation of delta-8 THC products. And so really the issue is that the language in this Farm Act wasn't really specific enough to prohibit the sale of any THC products that were derived from these hemp plants. So what that means is the Farm Act legalized the cultivation, agricultural, and development of products from hemp plants, so less than 0.3% delta-9 THC, but didn't really speak to regulation or sales of products of delta-8 THC. So that's where the kind of loophole emerged. So we don't have a lot of content on the delta-8 stuff here, but I did just want to reference, in case folks on the call are aware of this kind of emerging issue, that is something that has become a bit of an issue, that where there's not a really clear oversight, neither from the federal government or really at state levels, to deal with the delta-8 products, again, because of the Farm Bill. I do know that there are different discussions and potential bills that may be introduced in Congress to deal with the delta-8 loophole. Because again, the intent of it wasn't necessarily to allow for this explosion of delta-8 products. It's just, again, there was no specific language that dealt with regulating whether or not those products could be sold. And therefore, there's lots of other regulation things that don't have instances, like how they can be marketed, how they can be advertised, and those kind of things. Oh, I should mention at the, and I think it was mentioned, so if you have questions as we go along the way, definitely put in the Q&A box, because I know like that whole delta-8 thing I just said might be very confusing. So if you have any questions around that, please feel free to put those in the chat. So again, I don't have a lot of other content about the delta-8, but again, because it's an emerging issue, I did just want to spend a couple of minutes just to talk about it and where that emerged from. So looking at the difference between CBD and delta-9, so there's really some major differences. So CBD is, again, typically being derived from the hemp plant. So again, those plants that are less than 0.3%, but not exclusively. So there are CBD products or CBD containing products that can be derived from the marijuana plant. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about kind of state level kind of policy kind of things. But again, CBD, but commonly, especially when we're talking about the over-the-counter products that we'll talk about later and the FDA approved CBD product, we're talking about CBD that's been derived from the hemp plant. Now, and with CBD, there is no psychoactive effect, so it's not a chemical that's intoxicating when it's taken into the body, whereas delta-9 THC does have a psychoactive effect. Delta 8 does as well. Delta 8 THC does also have a psychoactive effect. The mechanism of action, how these chemicals bond and are processed in our brain and our bodies are a little different. So the mechanism of action for CBD is it interacts weakly with our endocannabinoid receptors. So specifically those CB1 receptor and the CB2. Meanwhile, with the THC, it binds very strongly with those. And so that's one of the reasons we see the difference in terms of how it affects intoxication because of that. That's one of the reasons we don't see intoxication with CBD because it's not because of the binding properties. Whereas THC, it binds very well. Because THC actually is the structure of THC is also very similar to the natural cannabinoid that we have in our brain and anandamide, which is sort of the natural endogenous chemical that tends to bind with our endocannabinoid receptors. The delta 9 THC molecule is so similar enough that it can have that strong bond. Another difference, so CBD inhibits the breakdown of natural endocannabinoids and possibly THC. So in some ways it can act as an inhibitor of some of the THC effects. I mean, a lot of it again has to do with ratios. So it's not really super, so there, there's a lot of caveats sort of with that statement. And with CB1R, so that's something that's prominent in our central nervous system, that receptor, so our brain and our spinal cord. But that CB2 receptor that THC binds with can be found on lots of parts of our body. It can be found in our stomach. It's present in immune cells, so it's in a lot of different parts of the body compared to that CB1 receptor. So these are kind of, again, the major kind of differences and intricacies between CBD and THC. Now, generally, sort of in the general public and broadly, people again think of CBD as the one that doesn't get me high and the THC is the one that does, right? But as we can see here, there's a lot more to it than that. So talk a little bit more, like how did we see this explosion and sort of proliferation of CBD products across the country? So again, going back to that farm bill, so that was that farm bill was passed in 2018, signed in late December, and that's really what legalized the commercial production of hemp by amending the Agricultural Marketing Act. So that's really what opened the door to allow for these products to be developed and sold commercially. Now, this is where I do want to make a distinction between really three different sources. So in a lot of the slides going forward, we're going to talk about FDA-approved CBD products, which really there's only one, which is Epidiolex, and then over-the-counter CBD products. And those are the products, again, that you're going to be able to buy in lots of different settings. You can see them in gas stations. You can see them in pharmacy stores like Walgreens, places like that. I mean, it's like a lot of retail places. These over-the-counter CBD products can be sold and marketed because of the Farm Act. There's really a third set of CBD products or CBD containing products, which are those products that are regulated or have been legalized in states across the country. And so those products that are in dispensaries may be more often than not are going to have a mix, may contain CBD, but they're also going to have THC. So when we're talking about Epidiolex, we're talking about a pure CBD product. There's no THC in there at all. Same with, but with over-the-counter, there should be minimal THC. We'll talk a little bit more later about how there could actually be a little bit of THC in some of these products, which can pose some issues. But when we're talking about the state sanctioned or regulated dispensaries, they also can sell products that contain CBD. So we don't have a lot of content specific for those products just because there's a lot of more unknowns there, because where they are regulated and sanctioned on a state-by-state basis, and there's different regulations and intricacies behind that, it's a little harder to get kind of themes or consistent across-the-board information on those kind of products. But I did think it was important to note that there's really kind of three groups or classes of CBD products we could be talking about when we talk about CBD. So, again, go back to the policy part of it, and just again to remind folks where New Hampshire is compared to the rest of the country. So in New England, we have most of our states that have legalized both what we call adult use marijuana, which is sometimes, or cannabis, sometimes referred to as recreational. And then currently New Hampshire has just a medical, or I know it's called a therapeutic cannabis program. Just in case folks are wondering what that looks like. So let's talk a little bit about pharmaceutical and commercial grade CBD. So there's really, as I mentioned, there's really only one CBD product at this point that is FDA approved, and that's Epidiolex. So this is pharmaceutical grade CBD, and it's sanctioned for the treatment of epilepsy. It's only available with a valid description, and normally it's administered orally with an oral syringe. So that's currently the only federally or FDA approved pure CBD product. There may be others that are being researched currently, but that's the only one that's actually approved and available in pharmacies. With over-the-counter commercial, and so the important distinction here is because Epidiolex is FDA approved, then they have oversight in terms of regulations around that product. When we're talking about the over-the-counter products, so those commercial grade CBD products, those are not FDA approved, which means FDA really has not the same level of oversight or really interaction with those kind of products. So when it comes to the marketing and availability of over-the-counter CBD products, there's, as I'm sure folks have seen, there's, they can be marketed in a lot of different ways as therapies to treat a lot of different types of health conditions. The thing to understand, though, is that when it comes to in terms of rigorous research on this, there really is a lack of rigorous research to really back up some of the, or most, if not all, of the claims that are made for these commercial over-the-counter products. So that's important for us to understand, but important for really the public to understand, is that just because something is marketed in a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that there's rigorous, and strong science to back up those claims. So the FDA, to this point, has been unable to evaluate and approve these products for, the usage for which they're being marketed. So there's really limited data to support the effectiveness of the product for these different claims. The other thing that's important to understand is that THC and CBD products are also currently excluded from the dietary supplement definitions, which is another reason, FDA doesn't really have, a good lane here for regulations. So what it really means is we, as a country and as a nation, we really need to look at finding a new regulatory pathway for CBD, so we can do that research, so we can better understand sort of the veracity of these different claims that we see in marketing. This is where it does kind of dovetail a little bit into what's legalized and whatnot in states. So the availability will vary a lot by state depending on regulations. Over-the-counter CBD products are available throughout the United States, so through a couple different main venues. One is through online retails, and then, as mentioned before, different types of brick and mortar retailers. So that could include drugstores, grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations. You can probably think of many others. Based on the data that we have available, it seems like most CBD sales are happening online, so about greater than 60%. But there's still 40% that are of these sales that are happening through brick and mortar locations. But a lot of the sales are happening online. So it doesn't really take a lot to Google to be able to find different places where you can order and purchase CBD, these over-the-counter CBD products.
And Scott, can I just bring up a question that Robert has shared with us?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So unless a product says FDA approved, we can't really trust the claims made by marketers?
What I would say is we just don't have the science. We don't have the data to back it up. So, I would be skeptical of if it's not FDA approved. And honestly, you could say that with a lot of supplemental or kind of health marketed products. It's not exclusive to CBD, but if it's not FDA approved and something is claiming to do something, I mean, generally, I would be skeptical, but specifically, we know when it comes to CBD that there really isn't. Again, we're talking about rigorous research. That's one of the challenges sometimes with marketing. Sometimes marketers, and I've seen this, they'll say something is supported by a study, but sometimes when they say the word study, what they mean is a survey that went out to customers, which is different than like a peer-reviewed research article. So that's another place to be skeptical, is when someone, even if they do say it's based on studies, like, well, what are those studies? How are they designed? Who funded them? Is it a survey? Is it double blind? Like, all those kind of things. So the devil's in the details a lot when it comes to that kind of marketing. But good question. Thank you. So again, what do we have for statistics in terms of the usage of the over-the-counter products? So you can see here some demographics that we have. So we have about 25% adults who've said that they've used CBD in the last 2 years, and about 33% who say that they've ever used CBD. Looking at some of the other demographics, so for 18 to 29-year-olds, you get about 20% that they've used in the last 2 years, 40% that have ever used it. With 30 to 49-year-olds, 16% that have used in the last 2 years, 32%, and then so on. Broadly, we've got a large part of the population that is at least familiar with CBD or CBD products. So 64% say, they've heard of that in some way. Nearly half of the CBD users, about 6% are millennials. Women use CBD slightly more than men, so about 52% of consumption is with females. Over half of users, almost half of users, 48% live with children under 18. 47, so almost half of the population, 47% think the government regulates CBD. So that's a big misconception there. And obviously they do regulate Epidiolex, but we're talking about those over-the-counter medications, not so much. There's about 22% who do not trust CBD. So there is about a fifth of the population that does have some skepticism with CBD products. And then this is really kind of mind-boggling. In 2020, CBD products generated over $5 billion in sales. So it's definitely a big, it's definitely generating a lot of sales across the country. So how is CBD used? So it can come in a lot of different forms. So it can come in food items, so things like chocolates, gummies, and candies, other kind of products like that. It can come in beverage items, so you can see things like CBD-infused sodas, waters, teas, smokable items, so smokable flower, vapes, cartridges, e-cigarettes. You can see it in topicals such as lotions, balms, gels, cosmetics, things like that. In oils such as tinctures with a dropper or a gel cap. Transdermally through a skin patch, eye drops, suppositories, and pet products. So you can see that it's just a wide variety of products that can be out there that contain CBD. And if folks have heard of other things, feel free to put those in the chat if you've seen anything novel that you haven't seen. You don't see on this list. So really it's really wide open again in terms of what can be created and marketed with CBD. So what do we know about some potential adverse effects of pure CBD? So, and this comes from the research that really went into the development of Epidiolex. So as with many FDA-approved medicines, one of the things they look at are what are some of the potential side effects or adverse reactions that come from using the medication. So that's where this list comes from. And so what's been observed is the following types of adverse reactions. So the sleepiness, which can be worsened or exacerbated with the co-use of alcohol. You can see decreased appetite, diarrhea, increased liver enzymes, which can be dose-related, especially if also taking valproate, fatigue, malaise, and weakness, rash, insomnia, sleep disorder, and poor quality sleep and infections. Other couple of considerations is we also can see some increased risk of drug interactions, so interactions between Epidiolex and other medications. And then some additional information that we'll talk about in a minute that can apply to pregnant and breastfeeding women. So you can see again, again, I think there's a common understanding around CBD again about it not being psychoactive and then not having some of the addictive kind of components or like THC. But again, when looking at this list, we can see that that's not all of the story, that there are some adverse effects that we are observing that we also kind of need to pay attention to. So what are some of the potential harms that are associated with the use of over-the-counter CBD products? So this is what we've observed so far, and research is ongoing, and this list may change and adapt as we move forward. So again, we are observing some adverse events, and a lot of the seriousness, how serious those adverse effects can depend on a lot of different factors. So whether there's other drugs being used, whether alcohol is being used, there can be some other just individual health conditions that could exacerbate adverse events. The other piece with this is there can be unreliable labeling when it comes to over-the-counter CBD products. So research has found that some CBD products are not accurately labeled in terms of the content, the amount of CBD that's in the product. So I've seen these studies myself where they'll go in and test different products, and either the percentage is a lot higher than was on the label or lower. So, and that's one of the challenges, again, with the lack of sort of federal regulation or the ability to federally regulate these products is, not having strong standards to have more reliable labeling of products. Unreliable purity with harmful contaminants. So there can be some purity concerns due to some of the unsafe manufacturing practices that have been observed in some of the over-the-counter products. It can be contaminated with THC. So either unlabeled Delta-9 or Delta-8 THC components or potency in the product. And this is an important point to, or actually, I think it might be in the next. This is a good place to point out that, again, so when these products are derived from the hemp plant, that is less than 0.3% THC. However, through the manufacturing process, that percentage could increase a little bit. There could be some concentration of THC just through the processing and manufacturing of the product. So what's important about that is while it may not be enough to be impairing or cause intoxication, it could be enough to pop up on a drug test. So for someone in a particular job where there's drug testing or pre-employment screening, if that's something that's going to happen, it's just a consideration for folks and something important to understand. And actually, we saw a case of this here in Maine, although it wasn't an over-the-counter product. It was, I don't think it was an over-the-counter product. I think it was in one of our dispensaries, but it was marketed as a mostly CBD product. It wasn't marketed as containing THC. But for whatever reason, again, whether it was through the manufacturing process or some other factors, there was enough THC in the product that when this individual had to go through mandatory drug testing, they tested positive and they lost their job. Now, there's a policy discussion and debate there about whether or not that should happen, but until there is policy change, with different employers and whatnot, it's just a point of awareness for, working with individuals who are in a job where there's drug testing and they are using CBD products. I think it just could be an important educational point that even though it's not on the label, it is still possible that it could be enough THC in there. Again, maybe not to cause intoxication, but if it pops up in a drug screening test, it could cause some problems.
And that was one of our questions. So thank you very much for that.
All right. Yeah, it's a trick. Again, you can see a lot of themes and how a lot of these things tie together, with the lack of ability, probably FDA would say, to regulate these, especially the over-the-counter products. It just opens up a lot of possibilities for problems. And then, again, one of the other harms, again, is the unproven health claims. They may delay a right diagnosis and treatment. So even if a usage of a CBD product doesn't necessarily harm someone, like physically, like it doesn't actually produce health harms because of usage of the product, If it does delay access to a better treatment, a science-based treatment, an evidence-based treatment for whatever's being treated, that is in another way a kind of harm. So it may not directly harm your health, but it may indirectly harm by preventing you from using something that could be more helpful. There have been increasing reports of emergency room visits related to CBD, and some of these can be intentional or unintentional use. So talking a little bit about populations of special concern. So, one big population, we're concerned about, of course, is pregnant and breastfeeding women. And this is really the case with both CBD and THC. But of course, today we're focusing on CBD. But so, one of the things, again, is the lack of human research. So while there is research ongoing, and, we've already talked a little bit about some of the harmful effects we know, there are still a lot of unknowns. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, you can see this even with marketing, that the amount of unknowns can sometimes be spun in marketing to mean it's safe just because we don't know something is harmful in a certain way. But I think it's important to really, in terms of, again, especially with education, that the absence of information doesn't mean we know there's no harms, right? Like the absence of information shouldn't be confirmation of either efficacy or safety. And so, especially with pregnant and breastfeeding women, I think that's we want to take a risk adverse, kind of posture with that, which I think we do. I think it's just it's an important thing to highlight, that while there's some knowns, there's enough unknowns where caution is definitely warranted, I think, with usage of these products during pregnancy and breastfeeding. There are some animal studies that are suggesting a high dose of CBD can cause some reproductive issues. So again, that's not human research, that's animal research. So we can't 100% draw conclusions from that, but it's enough, I guess, to put it on the radar, right? It's enough of a red flag to have it on our radar. CBD contaminants, especially THC, can pose a risk to the developing fetus or breastfed baby. So again, we're not spending a lot of time talking about THC in this particular webinar, but I would tell you that there is gathering research, suggesting that THC use during pregnancy is not a good thing, that pregnant breastfeeding women should avoid and abstain from THC use, because it can it does cross the placenta, and it can accumulate in the brains of the unborn child, which means that there could be some brain development impacts and some other health impacts. So that the potential THC contamination of CBD products is another reason, I think, for concern and caution of usage of CBD products amongst this population. So therefore, the FDA at this point does strongly advise against the use of any CBD products in any form during pregnancy or while breastfeeding. With children, one of the things we're, again, related to that THC contamination is the concern around unintended intoxication. And I think this could be more of a concern in some of the state regulated products, because states largely don't get into, with the products that are in dispensaries, they largely don't get into the content of products. They don't stipulate that there has to be certain ratios, or like products all have to be a certain percentage of CBD versus THC. So again, because of labeling and a lot of different issues, there can be some unintended intoxication that could happen. If a parent leaves a medication out, a CBD, THC medication out, or something like that. So, unintended intoxication is something we're mainly concerned with children. So just kind of wrap up what we've talked about so far. So CBD is increasingly available in many, many different forms. But as I talked about, there's really only one FDA. There is only one FDA regulated product at this point, which is Epidiolex, approved for treating seizures. The FDA has not approved at this point any of the over-the-counter CBD products, and also any of the products that are in the state regulated dispensaries. So that means the CBD marketplace is largely unregulated. But as we've talked about, CBD is still being marketed for a lot of different types of ailments, despite limited evidence of effectiveness. Over-the-counter CBD is can be widely mislabeled and can be of questionable purity. We again have observed from research that there can be some biological and chemical contaminants found in some of the CBD samples. It can contain Delta-8 or Delta-9 THC, and we've talked about some of the implications of that. Children can be especially vulnerable to CBD and should not be given over-the-counter CBD products. Pregnant and breastfeeding women should also be avoiding CBD products, as we kind of just discussed. So, as I mentioned, this does come from, a lot of this content comes from an advisory that SAMHSA put together. There's a lot more detailed information than I have in these slides, where you can get more information on or more extensive information on some of the points we've talked about. So as with any SAMHSA resource, it is free to download and use. So I definitely encourage you to check that out. There's also a web email address here of the folks that developed the advisory. You can feel free to contact as well if you have any questions about that product. So next I'm going to go to talk about some tips and action steps that we can take knowing with this information that we have, and then we can open up to some Q&A and discussion. So I've provided a lot of information here. So then that's sort of the next question is now what, like, how can we use this? And so in this advisory that SAMHSA put out, they did put together some recommendations for different audiences of the advisory and what they can do with this information. So for those community coalitions, prevention coalitions, treatment leaders, folks in the behavioral health sphere. So one of the things we can do is work with local health departments, regulatory agencies, and medical providers to disseminate the latest evidence on the risks and therapeutic potential of CBD, including that which is unknown. So it's really an opportunity for us to do this education with our partners in our state and our communities. We can educate the community partners and community members, including adolescents and young adults, about some of the short and possible long-term effects that we've seen associated with CBD use. And I think also, it's in a place where we can talk about some of these distinctions we talked about. So the FDA, Epidiolex versus the over-the-counter products versus what is available and sold in state-regulated dispensaries. The other thing that we can do in our communities is implement evidence-based programs to prevent the non-FDA approved CBD use by youth and young adults. And really, we can even look at other populations as well where we see some issues with that. So, with this information, it's just, again, I think it can provide an opportunity to think about like what kind of prevention programs and other educational programs can we bring on board to do this education and make sure we prevent and mitigate any potential risks and harms for these populations and others. For healthcare providers, so we can encourage additional clinical research on the effects of CBD. So we've talked here a lot about some of the knowns around adverse effects, but there's still a lot of unknowns. So, as really, probably not just healthcare providers, but really lots of folks can do this kind of encouragement and advocacy, like how do we expand clinical research on the effects of CBD. Healthcare providers can also learn about some of those potential interactions of CBD with alcohol, prescription, and over-the-counter medications, which will just help increase skills around being able to provide good advice around those things. Educating patients on the potential risks and harms associated with CBD use, including interactions with prescription drugs, dietary supplements, alcohol, and illicit drugs. So for parents, caregivers, and the general public, so one thing we can do, and particularly I think for those coalitions and entities that are doing education with children, is talk about risks and harms of using products that contain CBD. Now, I don't know if this is necessarily like a universal strategy. So, kids who are not aware of CBD products, I don't know, we necessarily need to go out our way to address that. I think it really could be more of a targeted thing. Like if we are aware of students that are maybe bringing product, I don't know if that's allowed to bring over-the-counter products into schools or not. That may be a case-by-case basis, but I think, again, not necessarily a universal program, but where we do know that there's CBD products being used either within a family or certain youth. It's just, I think, an opportunity to have those discussions to make sure there's understandings about what the risks and harms can be around that. I think generally not allowing children to use over-the-counter CBD use, again, getting past the fact that just because it doesn't make you high doesn't mean there aren't other implications for it, as we've discussed so far in the webinar. Consulting a healthcare provider before using any CBD products. So I think as much as we can encourage that, even though these are over-the-counter products and are widely available in stores and a lot of different venues, like encouraging that it's still good to talk with providers and have discussions about these products because of the potential drug interactions and other kind of health effects. Having an awareness that the risk of CBD products containing Delta-9 or Delta-8 THC is still unknown, and that use of these products could impact employment drug screening, as we talked about before. So I think can be an important educational piece, again, especially with adults, right, and young adults who are either in employment or looking for employment. We know may be using some of these products. I think it's just a good opportunity just to make sure there's some awareness about that potentially there could be enough THC to pop a drug screening test. So I think informational opportunity there. And then to encourage to discourage the concurrent use of CBD with medications, alcohol, and illicit drugs, again, because of the knowns and the unknown. So it's really, again, it's having a kind of risk averse approach to that. So the FDA does have a website, and you'll get the slides, so you'll have a link to this if it's something that's helpful for you. But for the FDA, it is helpful for them to get reports for folks who do experience adverse events related to a CBD product. Not so much in a sort of punitive kind of way, but I think this helps them gather information to just have a more clearer, robust understanding of these products and what they're doing. And some of the different health effects. So it just kind of helps build the evidence base for it. So I just want to thumb through a couple quick resources from PTCs. This is more broadly with terms of cannabis, not necessarily CBD specific, but just so you're aware of some of the things that we have of our PTTC, and then we'll go to some Q&A. So we do have at our New England PTTC a cannabis sort of library, which we call Focus on Cannabis Prevention, and it has a lot of different resources available there, such as toolkits, some national resources, recent journal research articles, social media kits and posts related to different prevention data and information related to cannabis, and some other resources there. We have a couple of micro-learning series that we developed. One is specific to vaping and one more cannabis prevention. And so what they are, they're short videos. They're like 5 to 7 minute videos with a couple like content questions at the end. So these can be helpful for yourself if you want to learn more about some of these different topic areas, but they can also be helpful for maybe coalition members or other partners who don't have the time maybe to sit through longer webinars, but still a good opportunity to raise some kind of education and awareness amongst different populations we're working with. We have a couple of self-paced courses that are on our Healthy Knowledge learning platform. So one is a 3-module course on cannabis pharmacology. The other one is on preventing underage cannabis use, looking at risk and protective factors and effective communication. And so with that, we have about 12 minutes for Q&A. And so I know you want me to prioritize here?
I do have some questions.
Okay.
Let's see. Other than epilepsy, do you know of any other conditions that CBD has helped with?
So nothing has been established through the FDA process. That's really using CBD for epilepsy is, there have been different studies looking at things like pain relief, and I know pain relief is one, but in terms of like really having a strong level of evidence behind it, that meets FDA approval. That's the only one that we have so far.
What about appetite stimulation?
I think that's one that's been researched. And actually, I think for both actually CBD and THC, there has been some research into that. It's just, again, just trying to be careful about how I say it, is that it's just, again, not an FDA level of approval. So it doesn't necessarily mean that research isn't happening and that there isn't some promising things emerging or evidence emerging in those areas. We just don't have the size or body of evidence to really comfortably say that it can reliably treat that condition. That doesn't mean that won't happen. I mean, I know one thing I didn't talk about is there, I mean, folks may be aware that the Biden administration is looking at potential rescheduling of cannabis. Right now it's Schedule 1, and that could potentially go to like Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. That could open up different avenues of research. So I would be surprised if eventually we don't see other sort of FDA approved medications. Just we don't have anything else at this point.
Okay, so being cautious.
Yes, cautious.
Yeah. Paula did share with us, it's not allowed in school as it is not FDA approved.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I mean, I know with THC, it's pretty clear because it is Schedule 1. But with over the counter stuff, like in retail stores, I wasn't as clear on the policy on that.
Robert had gone back to your comment about the devil is in the details, and he just made a comment, we would need to reach out directly to the supplier and hope they are telling the truth.
Yeah, and I mean, that's probably not a bad thing to do. It's like if you do, and if there is questions about the product and you're seeing marketing claims, I mean, I think it's fair game to ask, like, where does this come from? And some manufacturers may provide that, some may not. But it's a good. I mean, again, it's a good question to ask, probably with a lot of health products, not just CBD, but especially with CBD, just because of how popular it is and how widespread it is marketed. I think it's important to, and because of the lack of regulation on the marketing, there's just really no parameters or guidelines on how companies can or cannot or should not market. I mean, I'm sure, there may be like sort of associations of CBD marketers and they may develop amongst themselves some kind of guidelines or whatever, but like from a regulatory standpoint, there just really isn't any good guardrails around that.
Are they working on that? Are we going to have some guardrails?
I mean, I think if you see changes to the Farm Bill Act, and I think if you see changes in rescheduling, I think if cannabis got rescheduled, I think that's going to set off a lot of things. I mean, I think it's going to, and I want to be clear, I'm not advocating one side or the other
Right.
on the rescheduling, but just like factually, I think if it were to be rescheduled to either 2 or 3, it does open up things like more research, both THC, CBD, and then so there's more CBD. So that probably does open up some regulation lanes for CBD. We're looking at more either if medications to be approved by FDA or over-the-counter products the FDA could approve. So I don't know if they're actively working on it. I'm sure they're actively monitoring whether or not there are going to be any sort of changes by Congress to or by the administration to the rescheduling. I'm sure there's contingency plans being made if and when that happens.
Melissa asks, is it safer to buy from a dispensary?
I don't feel comfortable saying yes or no to that question. Again, I hate to say the devil's in the details. I think that the issue again is with the lack of research on both. And again, when I say research, I'm really talking about like clinical research. There's just a lack of that both in the over-the-counter space and the state and what's being sold in state regular markets. I would hesitate to say safer. It's potentially there's more information available. But again, it's going to depend on state by state. I don't know enough about New Hampshire's policy to weigh in on that. If someone on the call who can speak to that, I would defer to them. But yeah, it's hard for me to say it's safer. But by that same token, I'm also not going to say I can't say it's more dangerous to use one versus the other. It's I should say also, I mean, in a state dispensary, there can be more THC because products through state regulated dispensaries are going to be whole derived from the plant. So, the FDA Epidiolex is pure THC. It's not plant material. The CBD is being extracted and derived from cannabis, and you're talking about pure CBD in that medication. Whereas products in a dispensary are coming, are processed plant materials. So naturally, it is going to have a mix of CBD and THCs. Now, some products are intentionally created to have high CBD content and low THC content, and vice versa. So that's another important distinction with the state products, is just by that nature, they're more likely to have higher THC content. And then there's other risks associated with that, which we didn't even really talk about today. And then, we could do a whole hour on this. There's individual physiology really with THC, and probably with CBD as well. So the effects that THC has on one individual will be very different in another individual. So you could have two different people use the same product from the same dispensary. And at least on the THC side of things, we expect there could be very different reactions to that. We don't know enough on CBD to say that's the case, but likely it is. Likely, like some of the risk, the adverse effects that we talked about earlier may be more pronounced in one versus another. So again, on either side of the coin, I'm using a lot of words to say I'm not comfortable saying it's safer or more dangerous than over the counter.
And Scott, I did just bring Michael Holt,
Okay,
who's
great.
with the state. He has joined us, Mike.
Okay.
Hey folks, my name is Michael Holt. I'm the administrator of the Therapeutic Cannabis Program in the state of New Hampshire. That program is organized in the Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Public Health Services. I've been working with the program for since its inception. I can give you my 2 cents in the time that we have left. It shouldn't take long. In New Hampshire, CBD is regulated by DHHS in 2 areas. The first area is food protection, and the second area is where I regulate with the Therapeutic Cannabis Program. With regard to food protection, New Hampshire adopts the Federal Food Code, and CBD is not an approved food additive. So in New Hampshire, CBD is not allowed in food products, and we do enforce that in jurisdictions that the state has enforcement authority over. But because there are many self-inspecting towns and cities outside the state's jurisdiction, enforcement may not be consistent across the entire state. But in areas where we regulate food and food products, we do not allow CBD in those food products. But as Scott has said, it is the FDA's purview to regulate supplements, dietary supplements, health supplements, and whatnot, and CBD, mysteriously remains outside those classifications as well. So the second area that HHS regulates is in the Therapeutic Cannabis Program. We've got about 14,000 patients, New Hampshire residents, enrolled in that program right now. There are 3 what we call alternative treatment centers, or ATCs. That's the name that New Hampshire gives to the therapeutic cannabis dispensaries. So ATCs, we regulate those entities strictly, and all 3 of the ATCs that are licensed here in New Hampshire do provide and offer CBD products to patients, and obviously only registered patients can access those dispensaries. But all of them provide CBD products. All of the cannabis that is sold in New Hampshire from those dispensaries is produced in New Hampshire. Those 3 companies are vertically integrated, which means that they cultivate, manufacture, and dispense on their own. They're allowed to sell amongst each other, but they can't, get external CBD from industrial hemp. None of the ATCs grow hemp. All of the CBD products are created from cannabis plants, and they're extracting the CBD from the plants to make products. They do offer strains of cannabis, so flower, that are available that have higher levels of CBD and other cannabinoids, and lower levels of THC as product offerings. And they have many what we call ratio products, where, so say you buy a fruit chew or a tincture that has a ratio of 2-to-1 THC to CBD, or vice versa. But the point that I wanted to make, and what I wanted to jump in on, it's not a question of saying yes, it is safe, or no, it is not safe. But I wanted to offer that all of the products, sold at the New Hampshire dispensaries are under strict testing requirements for potency, contaminants, and strict labeling requirements. So the issues that you get for over-the-counter CBD products where you don't know what is in them, you don't know, the levels, if there's THC in them, where you don't know what the contaminants are, where you don't know if you can trust the manufacturer. Those issues are not issues that we see here in New Hampshire because we closely regulate those products.
Great.
Right.
Thank you, Mike, so much for that. We are at time, so I want to make sure I get Scott the last word here.
I just would say thank you for having me, but I put up my slide, last slide here for contact. So if you have more questions about this webinar, contact me, but if you have some TA needs you think we can help with, you could reach Scott, me, Aaron, or Sarah for that. So I just want to thank everyone. And thank you, Michael, for talking about the program. I definitely don't have a lot of familiar with it, so I'm really glad you chimed in with that important information.
Super.
Sure.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. Just a reminder, a recording of today's discussion will be posted on the education page of onwardnh.org. You will receive an email in the next couple of days, which will include links for the website along with the evaluation. Once you've completed the survey, you'll automatically receive a certificate of attendance. For questions or comments, please reach out to me at mwagner@naminh.org. And we look forward to seeing you on October 26th when we talk about helping someone who doesn't want help, the IEA process. Until then, thank you, Scott Gagnon and Mike for hopping in, Karen Prive. Take good care, all. Bye-bye.